Well, Jim, our next question sent to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from Gordon. There's been so much discussion about the awful booking in AEW on the show. I want to throw an idea out there and hear your thoughts. What if Tony Khan was to hire Paul Heyman and give him complete creative control? Do you think he could turn the show around and give us something worth watching? Could Paul Heyman fix AEW, Jim?
Okay, could he or would he is two different things. Could he? I haven't talked to Paul personally in ages, so I don't know where he's at. He's a few years younger than I am, as I like to remind everybody, because of the various ways that we both look now. If he was 10 or 15 years younger and you told him, Paul, here's a billionaire that is easily persuaded, easily led. He is a huge wrestling fan and it will not only fund this however it needs to be funded, but has television on TBS and TNT. And he is offering you full control of who to hire and who to fire on the talent roster and how to make the matches and how to use it or use them. And like I said, if Paul was, what am I, 61? So he'd be 57 now, maybe. Is he 57, 58? When's his birthday? I don't know. If he was 42 instead, I would say not only would he probably take that, but he could do it. As long as Tony stayed completely out of the way and let him do his thing, I think he could have. Now, would he be motivated? Would he feel like he has that long left in his life that he wants to fuck? Because it would take a while. And we're talking a couple of years. Does he want to dive headfirst into something like that right now, take all that burden, all that responsibility, all that work, all that grief and heartache, all those people to lie to, all those people to fucking swerve and con, to put the thing together where it would work, and he could do it? I don't think he'd want to do it. And it wouldn't be like the deal that Dixie offered him, because, I mean, he could tell that she was not only in way over her head and personally a nitwit, but there wasn't the financial backing. Maybe old man Carter had similar money, but not that he was showing any indication he was going to put in wrestling as the cons. And so that's why, as I've said, Heyman said, well, you give me a piece of the company, which was the one thing he knew was a deal breaker. You give me a piece of it, I'll come in and fix it. And she wasn't going to do that, and he knew that, and that's how he could stay babyface. Well, I tried, because he knew that company was unfixable. Even he couldn't have done it, because they didn't have the commitment to the finances. They didn't have the goddamn, may have had national TV on Spike, but they didn't have this kind of television at a point when Vince was vulnerable. And yes, they had a roster, but point is this AEW, if Paul was younger and was made the offer, could see that he could take advantage and manipulate Tony Khan in any way he wanted. He could get, like Jericho has, he could get any amount of money in any length of contract. Again, Chris Jericho will be under contract when he's 62 years old. So he would see that and he would go, yes. The only thing that would be stopping him now, I think, is if he just figured, why the fuck? It's easy over here, and I know the company's never going out of business, and I don't have to fucking go through headaches, and I could be with my family most of the time. But otherwise, it would have been interesting if he was a little younger. See, that's the thing. I never was at a point in my life where I wanted to just take advantage of somebody, even if they were a blithering simpleton. But Paul Lee always was. So Paul Lee would take this deal.
When you look at Paul's career, let's say as a wrestling executive, so from the early 90s on, and behind the scenes, what he's been doing, not even talking about anything in front of the camera. Do you think from the success we've seen, whether it's Brock or CM Punk or Roman Reigns, and probably a few people in between I'm forgetting. Do you think that Paul's better working with a handful of talent that he could work thoroughly with, as opposed to having an entire roster of people to oversee? Because let's face it, if you're going to fix AEW, that's a hands-on job right now.
Well, I remember it. He was always, in ECW, he was hands-on at the shows, but then once that everybody went back home, because it wasn't a full-time territory, everybody didn't live there. A lot of guys flew in, weekends, whatever. Once that, he was away from you or you were away from him or whatever, then you could never get him on the phone. And there was always the constant stories about, Paul hadn't called you back yet? Oh, God. And I did some of the same thing because it is a busy fucking job. But Paul would be a godsend to the program in terms of its wrestling value and entertainment value, and to the talent roster in terms of a tutor and a mentor and how to get the most out of the least if they listen to him. He would be he would be wonderful for Tony Khan because he'd be Tony Khan's best friend. They'd be inseparable. He would be a nightmare for the network and potentially the production crew and or the sponsors to work with, because he never hits a deadline. He's always got to cross a line. He's potentially going to get trouble with the sponsors or with the network for content, and or the fact that, well, remember, we've heard the stories going back to the days of their first pay-per-view. I think, who was it? It may have been Candido. It may have been somebody else, one of the many people in the company in the mid-90s when they did that first pay-per-view. Paul got fined by On Demand or whoever like $25,000 that they didn't have because he didn't deliver the goddamn. Remember the old Barker Channel pregame show?
Yeah.
The countdown show or whatever that you had to have for every pay-per-view, selling it. This is what you're going to see. Oh, call your cable company right now.
And it would have been in demand, I think, not on demand.
In demand, on demand, whatever. The pay-per-view company, they fined him because he didn't fucking deliver that. He was way over time. He didn't even start it till it was already late. So he was a nightmare to work with from terms of, and the production people that he said, just shoot whatever happens and we'll edit it together later on. There wasn't even any formats. He tried to write OVW television like that. Danny Davis wanted to strangle him.
But again, that's a younger Paul Heyman, and that's also a Paul Heyman without the funding for a real staff.
But who knows whether or not that he could work with a real staff, because he's a lot like me. He might want to work in those days, 3:00 in the fucking morning, or he might want to do something and then just hand it to you. I'm saying with eccentric geniuses, I'm just saying whether he was younger, older, or whatever, you'd still get Paul at his best and worst. You'd still get his best wrestling mind and him getting the most out of the least talent, and him, being able to get the people into a cult-like frenzy. And you'd also get him being hard to deal with production and or sponsors and or network and or other business vendors, because he's always behind, he's always late, he's always got an excuse, and he's not prepared in a lot of cases. Whereas that's Danny Davis went from me writing 27 pages of information for everybody involved in the show to Paul saying, here's the list of matches, let's just shoot what happens. So he went from one extreme to the other. But that's Paul's thing. He's an eccentric genius. He can think of these things, and he manipulates people's emotions. And you'd also get all the great stories that Paul would tell. And the one, was that Tommy Dreamer or was that Bubba Ray Dudley? Paul, I haven't got my plane ticket. Well, I FedExed it to you. Well, what's the tracking number? He rattled off a bunch of numbers. And then the guy says, well, Paul, that's one too many numbers. He said, I'll just take off the last 9. You get what you get. But he would definitely be able to run the locker room, book a better show, and put on a better production. It would get guys over and make more sense.
In terms of booking a show.
In terms of wrestling.
In terms of booking a show in 2022, do you think he would run into some of the problems that maybe you had with Ring of Honor? In that there may be some fans that want a Paul Heyman wrestling product, and who knows what that would look like in modern times. But if you're not delivering the product that the AEW fans are used to, the fans that like the Kenny Omega Young Bucks kind of stuff, or whatever it may be, because who knows how Paul would change the show. But whoever likes the stuff that is different will have a problem with what he does. Do you think the fact that he does have the reputation and he is Paul Heyman, is that a lot to carry going into a job like that?
I think if he bothers to go out and talk to the people, he'd have them believing, he'd have them, sticking their head between their legs and licking their own asshole. He can talk people into anything. And I thought where you were going with that question was not the fans, but
the wrestlers?
Would the wrestlers listen even to Heyman, the wise man? Would they take advice from him? If necessary, he would just confuse them to the point where they had thought of doing whatever he wanted them to do. There would be no contest between anybody in that locker room today and Paul Heyman. If he wanted them to do something and they didn't want to do it, they would leave the room having agreed to do it. Nobody's on his fucking level. Not today. So I believe he could bullshit in Buffalo, both the wrestlers and the fans, to give him time to fucking do whatever. And then by then he would have also set up the scapegoat for if something wasn't working. Well, it's a goddamn network. Remember, he even actually had a fake network representative who was Don Callis to fucking blame for shit that the fans didn't like, rather than just say, this sucks. No, it's the network. It's their fault. So he's smarter than all these people. And the thing is, that's always been Paul's deal. He spends so much time outthinking everybody to, I get what he used to. Now that he's settled down, right? And he's just the wise man for the bloodline. But he was always outthinking everybody else to get them to do what they wanted him to do, as long as he was okay with crossing the line into complete fiction, which he always was. Everything was fine.
Well, you have to be careful where you cross that line into complete fiction, because if you do it in the wrong setting with the wrong person... These days, you never know.
You can get sued, can't you?
You could, and Paul's dad was a lawyer.
And Paul Heyman's father was a lawyer, and he could sue the daggum bumpers off a car. But I'll tell you what. But I'll tell you what. Yeah, see, you tickled me. But I'll tell you what, if you want somebody to sue the person who drove their car's bumper into you, well, this is the man you got to call.
Call Stephen P. News. If you need to sue. An outlaw mud show or two. Those are the rest.
Folks, when you pick your personal injury attorney, I know you have choices, and there's some of them out there, they're ambulance chasers is what they are. And you can tell because they've always got big holes in their shoes and the bottom of their feet from running down the pavement chasing those ambulances. I'll have you know.
That's what the Velveteen Dream was yelling for. Where's my lawyer?
Where's my lawyer? Because he was running behind the police car. He was not only an ambulance chaser, he was a police car chaser. And that's the kind of people you get hooked up with if you just go to these advertisements on the side of a bus or a park bench or whatever. But when we tell you somebody can do something, they can do it. And I'm talking about the man himself, Stephen P. New at newlawoffice.com, 888-692-8084. The furthest thing from an ambulance chaser, ladies and gentlemen, he has such a reputation now, does Stephen P. New, that every time an ambulance picks up a customer, every time they pick up a patient, they take and they drive that person right past Stephen P. New on the way to the hospital. Stephen does not have to chase any ambulances. The ambulances parade the victims in front of Stephen P. New because they know down deep in their hearts that if that poor person laying on that gurney in the back of that ambulance that's been run over by a truck and then backed up over again, and their spleen is hanging out of their left ear, and their liver is propped up under their right mud flap. I'm telling you what, they know, the ambulance drivers know that the only man that can get even for that poor sack of body parts in the back of their ambulance is a wizard like Stephen P. New. He's the Paul Heyman of attorneys. You would think that Paul Heyman's father would be the Paul Heyman of attorneys, but no, Stephen P. New is the Paul Heyman of attorneys because he gets the most money out of the least people. It doesn't have to be a big company. He'll drain one of these son of a bitches dry if they ain't even worth a nickel 95. He'll find them money, get it to them, and then take it away from them just on your behalf. That's how good and charitable Stephen P. New is. He will actually go out and get money for some of these people that have harmed you or terminated you wrongfully or poisoned you or your groundwater or harmed your family with their negligence. If they don't have enough money, he'll go out and make them some money and then take it away from them and hand it right to you. What more can you ask from an attorney? And we talked about this big deal going on down in Louisiana with the energy company down there. They promised after Katrina they were going to revamp that grid. It was going to be able to withstand all these hurricane winds. Nobody was going to lose power and lose their respirators and lose their CPAP machines, and the old people in the nursing homes and the little babies in the intensive care and in those incubators or microwaves or whatever they put those babies in.
Incubators.
Yeah, well, it looked like microwaves. I guess if you set a baby for about a minute at 80% power.
No.
Don't do that?
No, we don't do that.
Folks, and here's another thing. If there's anybody in your neighborhood currently putting babies in microwaves, Stephen P. New wants to hear about it. That could be a suable offense. But back to Louisiana. So what they did was they got all this money from the government, the big energy company down there, and they didn't rebuild the grid, and they didn't strengthen the towers, and they didn't make it hurricane proof. They gave all their greedy executives a bonus. And what happened? Hurricane Burford come through here not long ago, wiped the whole thing out again. People without power for weeks. People are dying. People are sick. People have their faces pressed up to the window, trying to gasp for breath like a dying goldfish because they can't run their medical machinery without electricity because of these greedy corporate pricks. And Stephen P. New is going to put an end to that, just like he'll put an end to your suffering. Whoever's making you suffer, he'll put an end to them, boy. NewLawOffice.com, 888-692-8084. And he's just been featured on Slam Wrestling, Stephen P. New. He's an entrepreneur and a Renaissance man and a raconteur and a gadabout and a man about town.